Imagine this. You're flying 70,000 feet above the Earth, so high you can actually see the curve of the planet. The air is thin, silent, and below you is the most heavily guarded country in the world, the Soviet Union. Suddenly a flash. A missile streaks upward faster than anything human eyes can track. And in a few seconds, the United States' biggest secret comes crashing down. What followed wasn't just a plane crash. It was a diplomatic disaster that shattered trust between two superpowers and nearly derailed a peace summit that could have ended the Cold War. This is the story of the CIA's invisible spy plane, the pilot who wasn't supposed to survive, and the one mission that exposed the truth America never wanted to admit. Buckle up, because once you hear what really happened over Sverdlovsk that May morning, you'll realize one man's fall from the sky changed the world order forever. May 1st, 1960. The sky above the Soviet Union is calm, but not for long. High above the clouds, way higher than any passenger jet could ever fly, a slender black aircraft slices through the thin air. It's sleek, silent, and almost invisible to the radar below. The CIA called it the U-2. To the Americans, it was their ultimate eye in the sky. To the Soviets, it was an intruder, a ghost flying in forbidden airspace. The man at the controls was Francis Gary Powers, a skilled pilot on a top-secret mission. His job? Photograph Soviet military bases, missile launch sites, and nuclear facilities, all from 70,000 feet up. He believed he was untouchable at that altitude. After all, nothing from Earth could reach him, right? But down below, Soviet radar screens were lighting up like a Christmas tree. Dozens of operators tracked a strange object streaking across their sky. And on that quiet May morning, a single command echoed through a bunker near Sverdlovsk. Fire the missile. Seconds later, boom, a blinding flash ripped through the sky. The world's most secret plane disintegrated midair, and the United States' biggest secret came crashing down with it. What followed wasn't just a plane crash. It was a global scandal that blew open one of America's most daring espionage programs and derailed a peace summit that could have changed the course of the Cold War. The U-2 incident wasn't just about one man getting shot down. It was about technology, power, and pride colliding at 70,000 feet. And the fallout? Let's say, when that plane hit the ground, so did the trust between the world's two most incredible superpowers. To understand why that U-2 plane was even up there, we have to rewind a few years to the tense, paranoid heart of the 1950s. The Cold War wasn't just about nuclear bombs or political speeches. It was about information. Who knew what the other side was building? The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in this silent race, each desperate to prove they were stronger, faster, and wiser. The problem was that the Soviet Union was essentially a closed system. No one really knew what was going on inside. American intelligence agencies couldn't just send people wandering around Moscow with a camera. That's a quick way to disappear. Satellites didn't exist yet, and regular airplanes couldn't fly high enough to sneak a peek without getting shot down. So the CIA came up with something bold. What if they built a plane that could fly so high it would be untouchable? That's where the U-2 was born. It wasn't a fighter jet. It didn't carry weapons. It was a flying camera, a sleek metal bird designed to soar above 70,000 feet, higher than the range of any Soviet missile or radar. At least that's what everyone thought. The U-2 was the brainchild of a secret division of Lockheed known as Skunk Works, led by the legendary engineer Kelly Johnson, the same team that later built the SR-71 Blackbird. Johnson's team worked around the clock, designing a jet so thin, so light, that it could almost float on air. The plane looked fragile. Its wings stretched ridiculously long, like a glider that had wandered into a spy movie. But those wings were what made it special. They allowed the U-2 to cruise at the edge of space, gliding silently over entire countries, snapping high-resolution photos with cameras that could spot objects as small as a car. And these weren't just random photos. They revealed missile sites, nuclear facilities, air bases, and troop movements. It was the kind of intelligence the U.S. had been desperate for. President Dwight D. Eisenhower approved the missions, but reluctantly. He knew if one of these planes ever got caught or shot down, it wouldn't just be a bad day. It could ignite an international crisis. Still, the U.S. needed answers. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was boasting about new missiles that could strike anywhere in the world. America had to know if that was true, and how far ahead the Soviets really were. So despite the risks, U-2 flights began quietly crossing over Eastern Europe and deep into Soviet territory. The photos they brought back were pure gold for Washington, proof of what the USSR had and what it didn't. For a few years, the U.S. thought it had pulled off the perfect spy trick. The U-2 was invisible, unstoppable, untouchable. But what they didn't realize was that the Soviets were watching. They could see these high-flying ghosts like Koan. They couldn't reach them yet. And that's where the story turns. Because by 1960, Soviet technology was catching up fast. The sky wasn't as safe as America thought. And the next flight, the one Francis Gary Powers took, was about to prove it. By 1960, the CIA had run more than 24 U-2 missions over the Soviet Union. Each one was risky, but so far, every plane had returned safely. The Soviets could see the U-2s on their radar, but they couldn't do anything about it. Their fighter jets couldn't climb that high, and their older missiles couldn't reach. But technology never stands still, and neither did the Soviets. Behind closed doors, their engineers had been testing something new, a guided missile powerful enough to hit targets at the very edge of space, the S-75 Divina, known to NATO as the SA-2. It was faster, deadlier, and built for one purpose: to swat down high-altitude intruders like the U-2. Still, the CIA believed the odds were in their favor. And so, on May 1st, 1960, they sent up another mission, this time flown by a quiet, steady-handed pilot named Francis Gary Powers. Powers was a Kentucky native, a former Air Force pilot recruited for one of the most secret jobs in America. His orders were simple on paper: take off from a U.S. base in Peshawar, Pakistan, fly straight across the Soviet Union, photograph key military sites, and land in Norway. But he knew the truth. If anything went wrong, no rescue was coming. He was on his own. The timing, though, couldn't have been worse. May 1st wasn't just any day. It was May Day, the Soviet Union's biggest national holiday, a day of massive parades celebrating military power. Every radar station, every missile site, every air defense crew was fully alert. If you wanted to fly a spy plane unnoticed, this was literally the worst day to do it. Still, just before dawn, Powers climbed into his narrow cockpit. The U-2 wasn't a comfortable ride. It was basically a flying camera with wings. The cabin was so tight that he could barely move, and he wore a pressure suit that made him resemble an astronaut. Once he sealed himself in, the canopy closed, and the thin plane began its long, silent climb toward the edge of the atmosphere. At first, everything seemed fine. From that altitude, the world looked unreal. The sky above him faded from blue to black, and the horizon curved beneath him like the surface of a globe. He could see entire cities as tiny dots of light and rivers like silver threads stretching for miles. But below, Soviet radar operators were already on him. They tracked the intruder, crossing one defense zone after another. In Moscow, the alert spread fast. Fighter jets scrambled from nearby bases, but they quickly stalled out long before reaching the U-2's height. The only hope was the new missile, the SA-2 Divina. At a base near Sverdlovsk, the order was given: prepare to fire. Meanwhile, Powers had no idea how visible he really was. His instruments showed no warning, no radar lock, no sign of danger. At that altitude, the air was so thin that sound barely traveled. It was like flying through a vacuum. Then, out of nowhere, he saw a bright flash in his mirror. The missile detonated nearby. The shock wave slammed into the fragile U-2, tearing off a wing and flipping the aircraft upside down. At 70,000 feet, there's no air to fight against. The plane just spun and tumbled, breaking apart as Powers struggled to escape. The G-forces pinned him down, his instruments went dark, and pieces of the aircraft scattered like confetti through the thin sky. Somehow he managed to eject. His parachute opened, and for the first time, Francis Gary Powers looked down at the ground, at Soviet soil. He was falling straight into the hands of the enemy. As he drifted lower, villagers spotted him. Soldiers rushed in. When he landed, dazed and injured, they surrounded him instantly. He was captured alive, along with parts of the U-2's wreckage and its cameras. For the United States, this was the nightmare scenario. A pilot alive meant confessions, wreckage meant proof, and the Soviets suddenly had both. Back in Washington, no one was aware of any of this yet. The CIA just knew their plane had gone off radar. They hoped Powers had followed orders and destroyed everything before ejecting. But he hadn't had the chance. The Soviets now had the ultimate evidence of America's secret spy flights. And within days, they were about to use it in a way that would humiliate the U.S. on the world stage. At 70,000 feet, Francis Gary Powers was sitting in a world almost no human had ever experienced. The sky above him was black, not blue. The curvature of the earth was visible, and the clouds below looked like a soft, endless ocean. It was quiet, almost too calm, the kind of silence that makes you forget just how much danger you're really in. From the ground, Soviet radar operators were watching him move across their screens like a tiny glowing dot, a ghost they'd seen before but could never touch. Only this time, something was different. The new S-75 Divina missile batteries were locked and ready, and Soviet commanders were determined to prove that no American plane could violate their skies again. The order went out. Fire! In an instant, several missiles streaked upward, leaving behind the twisting white trails. Each one was faster than a bullet, climbing miles into the thin upper atmosphere, guided by radar and pure determination. Powers saw it before he heard it, a sudden flash of light behind him. Then a thundering explosion. The airframe shook violently. The U-2 wasn't built for this kind of stress. It was lightweight and delicate, designed for altitude, not combat. The blast tore through the rear of the plane, snapping off one of its long, slender wings. The aircraft pitched forward, spinning out of control, the cockpit filled with warning lights, alarms, and the deafening rush of wind. Powers tried to regain control, but there was no control left. The plane was falling apart around him. Inside that tiny cockpit, he was being thrown around like a rag doll. The G-forces pressed him into his seat so hard he could barely move his arms. His oxygen mask ripped away, his cameras and equipment tore loose, and in seconds, the U-2 transformed from the most advanced spy plane in the world into a falling pile of metal. Powers knew what he had to do: eject. But ejecting from a U-2 wasn't simple. At that altitude, the air pressure was so low that an instant ejection could be deadly. Plus, his seat was designed with a small explosive charge meant to destroy the sensitive camera equipment as he escaped. It was a fail-safe to prevent the Soviets from obtaining any evidence. But at this point, there was no perfect option. The plane was disintegrating. Powers managed to pull the handle and eject, but the force of the blast knocked him unconscious for a few seconds. When he came to, he was falling, all slowly beneath a white parachute drifting down toward Soviet soil. Below him, pieces of the U-2 were scattered across fields and forests. The Soviets could already see the parachute coming down. It was over. Powers landed hard in a field outside Sverdlovsk, bruised but alive. He tried to burn what little he had, maps, identity papers, but Soviet soldiers were already rushing toward him. Villagers pointed, shouting, and within minutes, he was surrounded. The mission was finished. America's best-kept secret had just fallen right into enemy hands. On the ground, Soviet officers couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had the wreckage, and a pilot, a live American spy in full-flight gear, was captured right in the middle of the USSR. For Moscow, this was more than a victory. It was a propaganda goldmine. Back in the United States, no one was aware of any of this yet. The CIA reported that contact with the U-2 had been lost somewhere over the Soviet Union. They assumed the plane had broken apart and the pilot was gone. But Powers wasn't gone. He was alive, in Soviet custody. And that single fact would soon turn this quiet spy mission into a global scandal. The Cold War had just reached a new height, and it started with one plane that fell out of the sky. Back in Washington, the mood was oddly calm. When the U-2 suddenly disappeared from radar, the CIA and the U.S. Air Force assumed the worst. That the plane had malfunctioned, crashed, and that Francis Gary Powers hadn't survived. It wasn't the first time a reconnaissance flight had gone wrong, and in the Cold War, plausible deniability was everything. So the U.S. decided to play it cool. They drafted a cover story. They announced that a weather research aircraft had gone missing somewhere near Turkey after the pilot had reported oxygen problems. It was believable enough. I mean, who's going to question a harmless weather plane, right? But here's where things get interesting. The Soviets said nothing. No press conferences, no big announcements, no angry radio broadcasts, just silence. For days, Washington thought they'd pulled it off. The cover story seemed to work. The world's attention moved on. But behind that silence, the Soviets were smiling because they had something the Americans didn't know. They had powers, alive, and they had the plane, mostly intact. You see, the U-2 didn't disintegrate completely. Large sections of the fuselage, cameras, and even sensitive equipment had survived the fall, including the high-resolution spy cameras that contained clear photos of Soviet military installations. In other words, undeniable proof of espionage. Then on May 7th, 1960, the trap was sprung. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev stepped up to the podium and announced to the world that a U.S. spy plane had been shot down deep inside Soviet territory. He described how the Americans had violated their airspace, how their pilot had been captured alive, and how Soviet experts were studying the wreckage. In Washington, jaws dropped. The White House had just finished claiming it was a weather plane. The CIA had just told the press that the mission had nothing to do with espionage. But now Khrushchev had the receipts. He waited patiently until the U.S. stuck to its lie, and then he revealed the truth. It was a masterclass in political theater. Suddenly, America looked caught red-handed, and worse, dishonest. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had personally authorized these flights, was now in a corner. There was no easy way out. He eventually had to go on record and admit that, yes, the U.S. had been running surveillance missions over the Soviet Union, all in the name of national security. But by then, the damage was done. Around the world, America's reputation as the honest superpower took a hit. Allies were shocked. Enemies felt vindicated. And at home, people were asking, how could this have happened right before a major peace summit? You see, Eisenhower was just days away from meeting Khrushchev in Paris, along with other world leaders, to ease Cold War tensions. The summit was supposed to mark a step toward peace, a thaw after years of icy suspicion. But now it was doomed from the start. Khrushchev demanded an apology and an end to the flights. Eisenhower refused. The Soviet leader stormed out of the summit, and the fragile hope for peace evaporated instantly. What had started as a top-secret mission to protect the U.S. had just backfired spectacularly, turning into one of the most significant diplomatic disasters of the Cold War. And somewhere in a Moscow prison cell, Francis Gary Powers, the man at the center of it all, was waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next wasn't just a scandal, it was an international earthquake. The U-2 incident made headlines around the world like an explosion. America had been caught red-handed, spying on the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. And there was no way to spin it clean. It wasn't just that the mission failed, it was that the U.S. got caught lying about it. Let's put this in perspective. The late 1950s had been icy but cautiously hopeful. Both superpowers were tired of tension, tired of near misses. President Dwight D. Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev were actually planning a high-profile summit in Paris to de-escalate tensions. There was even quiet talk of a potential arms control agreement, something that could have changed the entire tone of the Cold War. Then the U-2 came crashing down, and with it, the last shred of trust. The summit opened on May 16, 1960, but it might as well have been over before it began. Khrushchev arrived furious, waving the proof of American espionage like a trophy. He demanded a formal apology and the punishment of those responsible. Eisenhower refused. He admitted the flights were real, yes, but he wouldn't apologize for defending America's security. To him, the U-2 missions were a necessary evil, a way to know what the Soviets were really doing with their growing nuclear arsenal. But to Khrushchev, it was pure betrayal. The meeting quickly turned into a shouting match. Western leaders sat in stunned silence as the two most powerful men on the planet traded accusations. Khrushchev stormed out of the summit in protest, and with that, the dream of Cold War peace evaporated in real time. Back home, Eisenhower faced harsh criticism. Some Americans saw him as brave for standing firm. Others saw him as reckless for risking global diplomacy. And the Soviets, they doubled down, halting future talks, ramping up military spending, and tightening security against future spy flights. The U-2 program itself was grounded, temporarily at least, but the damage was already done. The Paris summit collapsed, East-West relations froze more firmly than ever, and the world slipped back into a deeper, more paranoid phase of the Cold War. And the irony? The U-2 program had actually worked. It had given the U.S. clear evidence that the so-called Soviet missile gap, the idea that the USSR had way more nuclear weapons, was a myth. The U.S. had been far ahead all along. But because of one downed plane, that valuable intelligence came at a massive diplomatic cost. In the end, it wasn't missiles or tanks that derailed peace. It was a single spy plane, a single captured pilot, and a single lie that spiraled out of control. The U-2 incident didn't just expose what was happening in the skies, it exposed what was really happening between the superpowers. A Cold War built on fear, mistrust, and the constant need to see what the other side was hiding. While world leaders were busy trading accusations and headlines were screaming about spies in the sky, one man was sitting alone in a Soviet prison cell. The pilot who had fallen right into the middle of history, Francis Gary Powers. After he parachuted into a Russian field and was captured by local farmers, Powers was turned over to the KGB, the Soviet secret police. From there, his every move was controlled, every word monitored. The Soviets had struck gold, an American spy caught alive, with his plane and equipment as proof. For months, Powers was interrogated, sometimes gently, sometimes aggressively, as the Soviets tried to squeeze out every detail about the U-2 program, the CIA, and what America really knew. But Powers, despite the pressure, mostly stuck to his story. He admitted what couldn't be denied, that he was flying a reconnaissance mission, but he refused to give away classified details. Eventually, the Soviets decided it was time to make an example of him. In August 1960, Francis Gary Powers was put on public trial in Moscow, and it was a show. Cameras, reporters, and diplomats from around the world filled the courtroom. The Soviet Union wanted everyone to see that the United States, the champion of freedom, had been caught red-handed breaking international law. Powers stood there, pale and calm, listening as the Soviet prosecutor accused him of espionage against the Soviet people. He explained that he'd only been following orders, doing his duty for his country. But it didn't matter. The verdict was already decided before the trial even began. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, 3 years in a regular prison, followed by 7 years in a labor camp. For a while, it looked like that might be it for Powers, that he'd spend the rest of the Cold War behind Soviet bars. But the story wasn't over yet. Because in the shadow world of espionage, everything and everyone has a trade value. 2 years later, in February 1962, a quiet exchange was arranged on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, the bridge that connected East and West. You might have heard of it. It later became famous as the Bridge of Spies. On one side stood Powers, escorted by the Soviets. On the other side stood Rudolf Abel, a Soviet intelligence officer who had been caught spying in the United States. In a tense, silent moment straight out of a Cold War thriller, the two men walked past each other, one going home, one heading back behind the Iron Curtain. Powers returned to the U.S. a free man. But freedom didn't mean peace. When he got back, not everyone welcomed him with open arms. Some in the CIA and the press criticized him, saying he should have destroyed the plane or even taken his own life instead of being captured. That was the harsh reality of Cold War expectations. But investigations later cleared him completely. He'd followed orders. He'd done everything he could. Over time, Powers rebuilt his life. He worked as a test pilot, then later as a helicopter pilot and reporter for a Los Angeles TV station. He kept flying. The sky was always part of him. Tragically, in 1977, Francis Gary Powers died in a helicopter crash while covering a story for the news. He was 47. Decades later, his name was cleared completely, and he was posthumously awarded several honors for his service and courage. But his story, That quiet man in a cockpit 70,000 feet above the Earth left a permanent mark on history. The U-2 incident altered the way nations gathered intelligence, handled secrecy, and the extent to which they were willing to risk for information. It demonstrated to the world that, even in the Cold War, one man, one plane, and one mission could alter the balance of power. Looking back, it's wild to think that one flight, one single mission, could change so much. But that's precisely what the U-2 incident did. It was more than a Cold War blunder. It was a turning point that redefined how nations viewed each other, how they gathered intelligence, and how they handled the truth. First, let's talk about the technology. The U-2 program had been revolutionary, a plane flying higher than any other, taking crystal clear photos of enemy bases from the edge of space. It gave the U.S. eyes where satellites didn't yet exist. But after the Powers incident, it became apparent that even at 70,000 feet, no plane was truly safe. The Soviets' surface-to-air missile, SAM, that brought Powers down proved it. Technology was catching up fast. That's when America doubled down on something new: satellite reconnaissance. Within a few years, the U.S. launched its first spy satellites, codenamed Corona, which could take photos from orbit and drop film capsules back to Earth. No pilots, no risk of capture, and no more awkward international apologies. In a way, the U-2 paved the way for the spy satellites that still circle our planet today. Second, there were the political lessons, the kind that stung. The U.S. learned the hard way that secrecy, when exposed, carries a global price tag. Eisenhower's administration had been trying to build trust with the Soviets while secretly peeking over their shoulder. When that trust cracked, it didn't just ruin one summit. It froze diplomatic progress for years. The incident also exposed a harsh truth about the Cold War. Everybody was spying on everybody. The U.S., the Soviets, the British, even neutral countries. They all had surveillance programs running quietly in the background. The difference was that the U-2 made that invisible game public. It tore away the mask. And here's something a lot of people miss. The U-2 incident also changed the public's relationship with their own government. For the first time, ordinary Americans saw their leaders caught in a public lie. The government had claimed it was a weather plane. They said the pilot was gone. Then, boom, the Soviets showed the world both the wreckage and a very much alive Francis Gary Powers. It was a wake-up call. Citizens began to realize that behind the confident speeches and patriotic slogans, their government was engaged in a secret world, one of espionage, disinformation, and quiet risks that could easily spiral into global crises. And finally, the human legacy. Powers' story became a symbol of the hidden costs of the Cold War. He wasn't a villain or a hero, just a man caught between duty and politics. In the years that followed, the CIA quietly honored him, and history softened its judgment of him. He'd done his job, followed his orders, and paid the price for a mistake far bigger than himself. Today, when you see sleek spy planes, stealth drones, or satellites snapping images from orbit, all of that traces back to lessons learned from this one incident. The U-2 forced the U.S. to think smarter, to innovate, to find ways to see without being seen. And strangely, it taught both superpowers something important: that in a world armed with nuclear weapons and global fear, information is power. But truth is even more dangerous. Because sometimes all it takes is one secret, one lie, and one spy plane falling from the sky to remind the world just how fragile peace really is. So here's the thing. The U-2 incident wasn't just a spy plane falling out of the sky. It was a wake-up call for the world. One mission, one pilot, one moment in May 1960, and suddenly everything changed. Francis Gary Powers didn't just survive a missile strike, he survived history. And in doing so, he reminded the world that even the most powerful nations are, after all, human. They make mistakes, they miscalculate, and sometimes the slightest misstep can have a ripple effect that spans the globe. The incident reshaped intelligence, diplomacy, and technology. It accelerated the rise of satellites, forced governments to rethink their secrets, and showed just how high the stakes were in the Cold War. And above all, it taught a straightforward truth. No matter how invisible you think you are, nothing stays hidden forever. And today, when we look back at that tense sky over the Soviet Union, we see more than a plane or a captured pilot. We see courage, we see risk, and we see the fine line between peace and disaster. And perhaps most importantly, we know a story about how one person's actions, flying a plane, following orders, and surviving against all odds, can leave a lasting mark on history that far exceeds anyone's imagination. So next time you think about espionage, politics, or technology, remember the U-2, remember Francis Gary Powers, and remember that governments and generals don't just shape history, it's shaped by people, their choices, and sometimes by one fateful flight that changed everything.